Hi, and welcome to TELS 3363 Lecture 10. This lecture is going to focus on doing research and using sources generally, but also specifically in terms of your assignment for Project 10. We're also going to talk about APA format, which is the citation style we'll be using to document our sources for this assignment. There is one video only for this week. As part of the research process, the first thing you really need to sort of clarify for yourself is what do you need to know, about this particular topic you're working on. You've got to prepare yourself adequately to inform yourself about the problem and to inform yourself about possible solutions. And also, what do your readers need to know? And these aren't necessarily exactly the same things. Your readers probably need to know a little bit less than you do, but you need to know enough that you can make the judgments about the information that should be included in your proposal. So think about what kind of background you might have to understand about the situation. So you might need to do some research into, obviously in our proposal, which has a fictionalized setting, but into the generalized topic. What are the current issues and concerns that surround this topic? What have people already tried in this area? How viable are certain approaches? You need to figure out where you can locate relevant sources, and the answer to that question is going to depend quite a bit on what you are researching, what specific topic you're researching. Some questions can be answered by sources that are more long-standing. Some kinds of questions need to be answered by very current information, meaning you're probably more likely to find that on the internet. So different kinds of questions will have different sources that answer those questions. You'll want to make sure you figure out whether or what information or data are going to support the conclusions you draw and the proposed intervention that you are going to present. And you'll also want to know if there's anything that might make your conclusions questionable or your proposed intervention questionable. Has someone else tried the idea before and not had success? Are there major concerns about this approach to the situation? You need to be aware of that so you can anticipate potential objections from the audience. We can classify the types of sources we do research into three major categories. Primary research are the interviews, surveys, observation, and original research that a writer might do. So scientists do a lot of primary research. You will probably not be doing any primary research for this assignment. Secondary research are what you do when you're reading other people's primary research. So if you're reading the results of someone else's survey, or the results of someone else's observations, or someone else's original research, you're doing secondary research. So probably this is going to be the bulk of your information that you find for sources in this assignment. What I call tertiary information sources would include things that are retelling other people's secondary research. So it's really very far removed from the original research. It's a source material that's often very pre-digested. It would include things like most encyclopedia entries. It would include abstracts or press releases that retell the results of research. So just sort of anything that's even further removed. There are lots of types of secondary sources that you might use in this assignment or any other assignment. And this slide sort of lists them roughly from what tends to be considered more credible to less credible. But that said, there are definitely some exceptions to this rule. Books used to be hard to publish. You used to have to go through quite a lengthy process. You had to have an editor. You had to find a publisher willing to take a chance on this. So it usually meant that books were pretty darn credible. But now that anyone can publish a book electronically, say through Amazon, it really depends on where you found the book. And likewise, on the other end of the list, even though we think of things like blogs and private websites as being not very credible, it depends on whose blog it is. If I was looking to see information on some sort of topic related to physics, and Stephen Hawking had a blog about physics, he'd probably be a pretty credible source on that topic. So if a person is an expert in their field, a recognized authority, then their blog might be a legitimate source. Probably for this assignment, though, you're going to find most of your information in periodicals, which you might locate via the university's periodical databases. Those you have access to as a student, and they've already collected credible sources and weeded out the sources that are not credible. Depending on what information you're looking for, government publications and organizational or government websites might be useful. Probably news organization websites will not for an assignment like this, and commercial websites may or may not, depending on the information you're looking for. If you're looking for information into, let's say, the effects of poetry on the reading abilities of young people, you're going to find that in periodicals that you're probably going to locate through the periodical databases. But if you want to know how much it costs to create an app, you might need to go to a commercial website for that information. So it will depend on what you're searching as to where you search this information. Generally speaking, your article databases are going to be a much better bet than a web search. But one thing that a lot of people don't know about is there's more than one Google. And you can use Google Scholar, which is scholar.google.com, to locate scholarly sources right from a regular web browser. A lot of times those sources will be available to you, but sometimes they won't. So usually you can see if it'll indicate if there is full text PDF available. If you're using a U of H computer, you will actually be able to see what U of H has if that source is available. And if you can't find something, you can't click through, you hit a paywall, you can always write down the title and the author and then go back and look for that at the article databases at the university. It's also a good idea if you are using a search engine to use technical terms, because you'll tend to get higher quality and more technical sources than if you use sort of everyday vocabulary in your search. You can't use Wikipedia as a source for this class. And, I'll be honest, I use Wikipedia all the time. It has a lot of use, and it can be a good way for you to get some general background about a topic. But one way I do suggest you can use Wikipedia for this project is scroll down to the Wikipedia entry for whatever the topic is that's relevant and look at their sources. And then you can maybe use those same sources to help you write your project. So you can't use Wikipedia itself as a source, but they may be able to point you in the right direction. Make sure wherever you find a source, especially if you find a source that is at a .com website, investigate who the author is and whether or not they are a credible source. So, maybe Google search that author. And be cautious about sources that are selling things or that might have a political agenda or some sort of financial agenda. Now, sometimes because you are looking for specifically financial information, you may need to go to that kind of site, but just be very cautious about this and kind of go in with your eyes open about it. It's also important when considering a source use to make sure that you're using sources that are current. And what's current is going to vary somewhat depending on the topic. Anything that involves a technological topic, anything that involves research into the use of apps or the research into the use of other kinds of technology has to be really within the past year or so, or it's out of date. But other kinds of research has a longer timeline. So, for example, research into the benefits of poetry might be something that's pretty stable over the past decade or two. So, currency is going to vary depending on the topic. In general, you do want to avoid web sources that do not have an author listed. If someone is not willing to put his or her name on a topic, it may indicate that that source is just less credible. You also want to avoid what I call pre-digested sources, summaries, abstracts, and press releases. Those are already someone took some information, they've already condensed it, they've already sort of processed it in some way. So you're not getting the original information, you're getting someone else's take on the original information. So if you find an article, say on the internet, and you're only able to access the abstract from it, and then you hit a paywall, that's not good enough. You need the actual article, not just an abstract or summary of it. So in that case, make sure maybe you write down the full source information so that you're able to look up that source on the library databases. And as you are doing your research, I do strongly recommend you write down the pieces of information you will need to create a citation for your sources as you do your research. So make sure you document the name of the author, document the title of the article, document the container source that it came from. That would maybe be like the journal or the newspaper or the general website that the article came from. Make sure you're getting the year of publication. If it's a website, make sure you've written down the whole URL, every last bit of it. If it is some sort of database, make sure you write down the database name. So gather this as you do your research so you're not scrambling to find it at the last minute to create your reference list or your in-text citations. And this is important for avoiding plagiarism. Now, that's not the only way that we avoid plagiarism. Plagiarism, of course, is defined as taking someone else's words, ideas, or perspectives, or perhaps their images or music they've made, or basically anything that came from someone else, and representing them as if you were the one who created those things. Now, a lot of times people don't do that intentionally. They're not trying to pull the wool over everyone's eyes. They're not trying to fool anybody. But they unintentionally plagiarize because they do not give credit where credit is due. So anytime you do borrow anyone else's information content, you must document that source accurately. That includes quoting, paraphrasing, and summarizing, which are the major ways we're probably going to be using information from sources on Project 10, but it also covers any images that are used, any sound clips, any videos, even, emojis that are, not the standard emojis, something special, anything that would appear in a document that you didn't create, any idea you didn't come up with, you do need to document. So give credit to whoever came up with this information. It's not just something we do to avoid trouble in school. It actually gives you credibility because it shows that, hey, this isn't just this student saying this. This is an authority in the field who says this. So avoiding plagiarism has multiple benefits, as well as meeting ethical obligations and the obligations of many school assignments. We're going to be using APA citation style in this class to help us avoid plagiarism. APA citation style has two parts. It has in-text citations, so those are the citations that will come in the body of your letter, or if you are writing a different kind of document, the body of your paper. And the other part is a reference list that will appear at the end of your document. So if you've done MLA is a little bit similar. You also use in-text citations plus a reference list, which in MLA is called a works cited. So APA works the same way. You need both of these elements in place. You cannot just have a reference list or works cited list and leave out the parenthetical references. You must have the parenthetical references as well. For every in-text reference, you should be pointing the reader to the full citation in the reference list. For every source in your reference list that's listed, it should be demonstrated in your document one or more times with an in-text citation. So in our assignment here, you've got to have at least 5 sources, which means that your reference list would have at least 5 sources listed. And because each source has to be used at least once, you will have a minimum of 5 in-text citations. But if you use a source more than once, even if you had 5 sources, you would have more than 5 in-text citations because every time you use information from a source, you need an in-text citation. So there are a lot of great resources to help you with APA citation style. The APA has a website that you can consult. They're obviously the ultimate authority here. They don't offer a ton of information at their site because they'd like you to buy their book, but they do have some quick answers, sort of frequently asked questions links. I recommend very highly Purdue OWL's website. If you Google Purdue OWL APA, you can find extensive information on APA formatting over multiple web pages, almost any topic you can imagine. I've uploaded a handout from our friends at Lone Star College in Blackboard Learn. It's a very short PDF that's a really excellent overview of most of what you need to know about APA format. Also, our textbook covers APA citation style on pages 651 through 663. I have to admit I'm not a big fan of citation generators, but they are potentially another resource for dealing with citation creation. So one part of APA citation is the in-text citation. The in-text citation are the parenthetical references that occur right next to any piece of information you have borrowed from a source, whether you are quoting, summarizing, or paraphrasing that source information. Every time you use information from a source, you will need to use an in-text citation at that location. In APA, these in-text citations occur within parentheses at the end of a sentence. They typically indicate the last name of the author and the copyright date. If you don't have an author's name, in place of the author's name, you use some sort of shortened version of the title, which would go within quotation marks generally speaking. You would still have the copyright date in that instance. And if the source you're using originally had page numbers like a book or a printed article, you would also give those page numbers within the parenthetical reference. So let me show you what that would look like. This slide gives some examples of what those parenthetical references might look like. The first line is sort of the classic basic example of an APA in-text citation. We have the author's last name, followed by a comma, followed by the year of copyright, and that is enclosed within parentheses. The second example here is what you might do if in the course of just sharing the information you happen to mention the author's name anyway. You wouldn't need to repeat the author's name in the parenthetical reference if you had already introduced the author's name into that sentence. So at that point you would just use the parenthetical reference with the year of copyright. The third example on this list is a situation where there's more than one author of the source. So perhaps this article was written by James Mack and Michelle Fromage. And so in the parenthetical reference we just have their last names and the date of copyright. The next example is a situation where we don't know an author. We couldn't find an individual or corporate author's name, so we're just using a shortened version of the title instead of that. So the title of a short source would go within quotation marks, and we can imagine maybe this original title was longer. Maybe it was Social Media Use by Adolescents in 21st Century America. Well, that's a really long title to put in a parenthetical reference, so we make it a little bit short, but not just one word typically, and that will point the reader to the full title and full citation information on the reference list. We do still include the year of copyright. And the final example is an example of a corporate author. So just because we don't have individual human beings' names doesn't mean we don't have an author, and in this case an organization is the author. They are the people presenting this information. So often that might be true of a government agency like the Centers for Disease Control. That's the author, the CDC. An organization can be an author. So this is not, every single type of in-text citation you might ever encounter, but these are some of the more common situations you will encounter in creating in-text citations. Now, the reference list will definitely have every source that you use listed at the end of the document with the full information. So the in-text citations just give us the name of the author and the year, typically just those two pieces. The reference list will include a lot more. Here are some tips to help you put your APA reference list together. First of all, you'll want to make sure you alphabetize your entries on your reference list. Do not number them and do not list them in the order in which they appear in your document. Typically, they will be alphabetized by the author's last name, but basically whatever is the first piece of information in the entry is the part by which you will alphabetize that. You'll also need to use what's called a hanging indent paragraph style, and if you're not sure what's meant by that, the next slide will illustrate that for you. You write out the last name of each author, but only provide the first initial for each author. And if there are multiple authors, list them in the order that they are listed on the source. Do not alphabetize them. They probably arm wrestled to get to see who goes first, so you want to maintain whatever order is presented to you. In APA format, you only need to capitalize the first word of a title or subtitle. Don't capitalize every word. You'll want to use italics for the titles of longer works like books and journals. But don't use italics for short works like article titles, chapter titles, or web page titles. Unlike MLA, though, you don't use quotation marks on those shorter titles. They just don't have anything that distinguishes them on the reference list. Now, if you do have the title of an article, a chapter, or a web page in your in-text citation, or if you just mention it as part of your prose writing, you do need to put that within quotation marks. It is only in the reference list that article titles do not use quotation marks. If an article actually comes from a journal database, you also do have to include the name of the database in your reference list citation. Many of you will be using web sources though, so you'll want to have a stable internet address that is going to help me get as close to the work as possible. So if you found something, let's say at the CNN website, just telling me this is at CNN.com is not good enough. There's millions of articles at CNN.com, so you need the actual URL for that particular article. You also need to have the date you retrieved the information, especially if you don't have the date that it was published. So you might not be able to say this information was published in the year 2015, but you can certainly say that as of October the 31st of 2017, it was here. And so you will need to do that. This is a sample reference list that consists of unrelated sources that weren't really used for a proposal for this class. They just illustrate some of the different kinds of sources and some general principles of what a reference list should look like. One thing you'll notice here first off is the hanging indent paragraph style I was talking about before. So in the hanging indent paragraph style, the first line of each entry on the reference list touches the left-hand margin of the document. Subsequent lines after that are indented by one tab. Now you don't actually indent that by hitting the tab key. What you'll want to do is actually use the formatting tool in your word processor. So typically after you type up all the information, select it all, right-click on it, choose paragraph, and then you'll get some options for paragraph formatting. There's typically a drop-down that will allow you to select hanging indent as the paragraph style that you use. You'll notice here that everything is alphabetized by that first line of the reference list, what I sometimes call the part that sticks out. So whether it's an author name, an organizational author, or a title, whatever is the first item in the reference list is the part by which these entries are alphabetized. So these are different kinds of sources, and I'll briefly kind of run through what each of them are. The first source is an article from a newspaper. So you'll notice the article title does not use quotation marks. It is an article that is not attributed to an author, so it just begins with the article title. The second piece of information in any APA reference list is always the date. So even though we've begun with a title instead of an author in this first entry, the second piece of information is the date. In all of the other entries, you'll notice we begin with an author, whether it's a single author, a corporate author, or multiple authors. So that author information is then followed by the second piece of information, which is always the date. Back to that first example, you'll see the container source for this article, which is Wall Street Journal. It's italicized because it's a longer source, and this was actually a print source, so the page reference is given. Our second source is an article from a journal called DLib Magazine, and that journal has an issue and volume number represented next to it where we can find that article. The article's title is Copyright Renewal, Copyright Restoration, and the Difficulty of Determining Copyright Status. This particular entry also has a DOI number, which is part of APA format. If you have one, usually you should include it. It is not necessary for this assignment, however. Our third source is a little different in that it has a corporate author. We don't have an individual human being, but we have an organizational entity that is the author of this source. And this source is evidently a book because you'll see that the title, which comes right after the date, is italicized. So that tells us this is a longer source. But it's a book that was retrieved online from a website, so it's some sort of electronic book. The website is given that would help us to access this book in addition to the date of retrieval. The fourth source is another journal article, but this one is written by two authors, so that's why we see both authors' last names and first initial. This article was published in 2007, and we see the article title followed by the journal title, which is italicized, the volume and issue numbers, and the page numbers, as well as the DOI number. And our last source has three authors. Again, each of their last names and initials are presented, as well as the date of publication. The title shows that this is about the enjoyment of peas, and it comes from a journal called the Journal of Abnormal Eating. I would say it is pretty abnormal to enjoy peas, in my opinion. The volume number and issue number are then presented, as well as the page number, and this was actually retrieved from an online source, so that information is given as well. Here are a few more quick citation tips. First and foremost, if you are ever in doubt as to whether you need to cite a piece of information with an in-text citation, cite it. When in doubt, cite, because you will never get in trouble for citing too much, but you might get in trouble for failing to cite information that needed a citation. If you are unable, when creating a citation from a source, to find author information or date information or even publisher information, you might want to consider whether you could find a better source, something that's a little bit more credible that someone was willing to actually put his or her name on. Occasionally an unsigned article will be helpful, but often you can find something better and something that will reflect better on your ideas because you have a more credible source. Remember that every single source on your reference list, of which there should be a minimum of 5, must appear in one or more in-text citations in your letter. So if you have 5 sources on your reference list, I should see at least 5 in-text citations showing me where you used each of those source materials once. If you've used any of them more than once, I should see more than one citation for that. So 5 is the minimum number of in-text citations I'll be looking for, but you can have more than that. Every in-text citation in your letter must point me back to a source in your reference list. So you must have a minimum of 5 sources on your reference list. And by the way, the Academy of American Poets website and the NEA's website do not count because from the standpoint of this grant application, you are the Academy of American Poets. You would not cite your own website as a source. You also wouldn't cite the request for proposal as a source. So these need to be 5 outside sources that you are referring to. And while citation generators can be helpful for some people, remember they're only as accurate as the information you give them. So if you're giving them bad information, you will get a bad citation back. You need to make sure if you use a citation generator that you are selecting the right kind of citation style. So select APA, not any other citation style. And you'll also need to make sure that you're selecting the right kind of source because that will determine which fields it gives you as prompts to fill in. So it usually defaults to basic book, But if you've got a website or if you've got a journal article from a database, that's not going to help you out. So you'll have to be careful about that. I'm not a big fan of them. It's not that hard to create these citations. The rules are fairly simple, but if you use one, be careful. This week there is nothing due. Hallelujah. But be sure to keep working with your group members. I will post a reminder announcement in Blackboard Learn. I'm going to ask everyone to post at least once this week again to the group discussion tool so that I can just make sure that everyone is working. I don't really care what you're doing and saying in the group or outside the group. My interest is just making sure that everyone in class is actively involved in their groups. Next week, you don't have a reading assignment or a lecture video, but you will want to make sure you're using that time to continue to work with members in your group. And if questions come up about the assignment, whether it's about research or APA format or just generally anything about the proposal assignment, whether your topic is a good topic, whether you guys are handling something right, whether a particular source sounds useful, any questions, please post to the questions forum sooner rather than later. Do not wait until a day or two before the assignment is due to ask your questions. Ask them as much in advance as you can. So until after our proposals due, we'll have our next and final lecture, but until then, this is our last lecture. Let me know if there's any questions, and good luck as you continue to work on your proposal.